In the remote valleys of West Virginia, 1874, a boy was born unlike any the world had ever seen. His name was Thomas Weaver, but he was no ordinary child. Something in his eyes, in his silence, chilled the hearts of all who met him. Shadows twisted unnaturally in his presence, animals fled, and the very air seemed to bend around him. Science could not explain him, reason could not touch him, yet every whisper in the valley knew the terrifying truth. Thomas Weaver was not just a boy, he was a living enigma, a sinister presence that haunted Appalachia, and his story is one that no one should ever forget. If you want to hear more chilling tales like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the darkest mysteries waiting in the shadows. In the winter of 1874, deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, there emerged a boy whose very existence seemed to defy every law of science and faith, a boy named Thomas Weaver, whose story was whispered in trembling voices around fire-lit cabins, as if uttering his name too loudly might summon the presence that never truly left these woods. For the villagers claimed his birth was marked by an unnatural silence, when the howling wind froze in mid-breath and even the cries of his laboring mother dissolved into an eerie stillness, as though the world itself paused to witness the arrival of something it was never meant to see, and when he finally opened his eyes, they were not the eyes of a newborn but the hollow, piercing gaze of something far older, as if time itself had been poured into a fragile body, and the midwife who held him swore she felt her own heartbeat falter beneath his stare, dropping the child in terror before declaring that the devil had planted a seed among them. Yet the boy cried not, smiled not, only watched, as if already aware that he was not meant to belong, and from that day forward the people of the valley would never sleep peacefully again, for Thomas Weaver was no ordinary child, but a question without an answer, a shadow dressed in flesh, a boy that science could never explain. As Thomas grew, the strangeness around him grew as well, for unlike other children who stumbled, cried, and learned to walk with shaky legs, Thomas drifted across the floor as though the earth itself bent beneath him, his footsteps soundless, his movements smooth, too smooth, so much so that mothers would pull their children away when he passed, whispering prayers under their breath, and yet his father, a humble farmer, tried desperately to raise him as normal, refusing to believe the rumors that spread like wildfire through the hollow. But no matter how much his parents tried to hide him from the stares of neighbors, the boy's nature revealed itself in terrifying ways, for livestock refused to graze near him, dogs howled endlessly in his presence, and once, when a lantern accidentally fell near him, instead of flinching or crying out in fear, Thomas simply stared into the fire as if it recognized him, as if the flames themselves bent lower in submission, and by the time he was 6 years old, the villagers swore he never aged like other children, his face remaining eerily unchanged, pale and gaunt with those deep-set eyes that seemed to drink the light out of any room, and the elders muttered that he was not born but sent, a vessel carrying something far older than their town, something that science could not, and would not, ever untangle. And at night, when the mountains groaned with the weight of wind, the people heard faint laughter echoing between the trees, laughter too soft to trace, yet unmistakably belonging to Thomas Weaver. By the time Thomas reached the age of 10, fear had settled into the marrow of every villager, for children whispered that he appeared in places where no one had seen him enter, standing silently in doorways or at the edge of fields just watching, his hollow stare freezing them in place until they ran screaming to their homes. And yet whenever an elder confronted him, the boy's expression remained blank, lips curved in a faint, unreadable smile that seemed less like innocence and more like mockery. And strange happenings followed wherever he lingered. Milk curdled overnight, crops blackened as though touched by frost in the middle of summer, and once, the church bell rang out at midnight though no wind stirred, its echo rolling through the valley like a funeral toll, and when the townsfolk rushed to the steeple they found Thomas sitting at the base, barefoot in the snow, his skin pale as bone but unbothered by the cold, eyes fixed upward as though he had been waiting for them, and no matter how many times they questioned him, he never spoke, never explained, simply rose and walked away with the same soundless steps, leaving behind only that crushing weight of silence, heavier than any scream. And soon parents forbade their children from speaking his name at all, convinced that to acknowledge him was to invite him closer. Yet he came anyway, appearing in dreams, in reflections, in shadows that did not belong, and every man, woman, And child began to understand that Thomas Weaver was not just a boy of their town, but something that lived beneath it, around it, and inside of it, and science could do nothing but stand outside the mountains, powerless, staring into a darkness it could never measure. The town's physician, Dr. Elias Cartwright, was the first man of science to lay his hands upon Thomas Weaver, convinced that the boy was merely afflicted by some rare condition, a mystery to be solved rather than feared. Yet when he examined him under the dim oil lamp in his cabin, what he found stripped the certainty from his heart, for Thomas's pulse was faint, so faint it seemed to vanish when he pressed his fingers to the boy's wrist, and his skin carried a chill as though he had been carved from ice. And yet, beneath that fragile body, there was a strength, his grip crushing, unnatural, far beyond what any 10-year-old could possess. And when the doctor leaned close with his stethoscope, straining to hear a heartbeat, he froze. For what echoed through the instrument was not the rhythm of life but a hollow resonance, a deep vibration like the toll of a bell in some cavern far underground. And in that moment Dr. Cartwright swore he felt the room tilt, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls as if the boy's body was not entirely bound to the world. And when their eyes met, the physician collapsed backward, gasping as though all air had been stolen from his lungs, his hands trembling so violently he could not even write down what he had witnessed. And from that night forward he abandoned medicine altogether, retreating into silence, refusing to speak Thomas's name again. For how could science explain a child whose heart rang like a cathedral bell, whose very presence bent reality at its seams, and whose silence was heavier than any scream ever could be? By the age of 12, Thomas Weaver had become more than a boy to the people of the valley. He was a legend whispered in terror, a shadow that haunted even the bravest men when they were alone. And there were nights when farmers awoke to find their barns emptied, livestock scattered or dead, yet not a footprint, no sign of human trespass, only the faint imprint of small bare feet in the frost, impossibly deep and yet impossibly light. And mothers swore that Thomas could appear at a window without sound, staring silently with those eyes that seemed to pierce into the very soul. And once a man attempted to confront him with a lantern blazing, demanding an explanation, but Thomas did not run, did not flinch. Instead he smiled, that same faint, unknowable curve of lips, and the man collapsed moments later as though the air itself had turned to iron around his chest, gasping and coughing until the boy simply turned and walked into the darkness, leaving a chill so intense it lingered long after he was gone. And the townspeople began to whisper of unnatural ancestry, of dark pacts made generations ago, of spirits that lingered too long in the bones of men. And even the bravest children, who had once dared to follow Thomas through the snow-drenched woods, returned trembling, muttering of voices not their own, of whispers in the trees calling their names, and of a presence that watched with infinite patience. And in every whispered tale, one truth became undeniable: Thomas Weaver was no mere boy, no child of flesh and blood alone, but a living question that science could not, and would never, unravel, a shadow that moved just beyond reason, waiting, always waiting, for the world to understand that it had been touched by something far older, far darker than it dared imagine. The forest itself seemed to bend to Thomas Weaver's presence, the wind shifting in unnatural patterns whenever he walked among the towering pines, the shadows lengthening and twisting as if alive. And villagers began noticing that nights grew quieter, too quiet, as though even the creatures of the woods feared him. And once a hunter claimed he saw Thomas standing atop a ridge, impossibly still, watching the valley below. And the man later confessed that he had felt a deep, paralyzing dread creep into his bones, an inexplicable certainty that the boy could will him to his death with nothing but a glance. And strangers who passed through the hollow spoke of an overwhelming sense of being followed, their eyes catching glimpses of a pale, angular face in the trees. And in every encounter the air seemed heavier, the cold sharper, as though reality itself resisted Thomas's mere existence. And yet the boy did not speak, did not cry, did not even blink unnaturally, only observed with that eternal, hollow gaze, leaving anyone who met it haunted, forever aware that the world contained a being that belonged to neither man nor nature, that science could not define. And in the quiet of their cabins at night, parents prayed endlessly, whispered sacred words to shield their children. Yet Thomas Weaver moved freely, a ghost made flesh, and every whisper of the wind, every unexplained shadow, carried with it the unmistakable signature of the boy whom no law of life or nature could ever explain. By the time Thomas Weaver reached 13, the valley itself seemed to recoil from him, and even those who had once attempted to approach him did so with trembling hands and downcast eyes, for every encounter left a lingering sense of wrongness, a weight pressing on the chest as if the boy carried the sorrow of centuries, and there were stories of villagers finding him in their homes at night, sitting silently in corners, staring at walls as though he could see into another dimension entirely, and animals, even the fiercest dogs, would shrink away, hackles raised, ears pinned, refusing to cross his path, and travelers spoke of feeling a presence at their backs, an icy brush along the nape of their necks, and when they dared to look, they would glimpse him just beyond the shadows, motionless, eyes unblinking, smiling faintly as though privy to a secret that no one else could ever hope to understand, and Thomas's silence was louder than any scream, heavier than any threat, a living proof that some mysteries could not, and should not, be solved, and while the townsfolk debated whether he was cursed or chosen, every one of them understood instinctively that science had no place in the woods of West Virginia, for the boy they called Thomas Weaver was a question, an enigma, a darkness made flesh that haunted their dreams and lingered in the spaces between light and shadow, and even the mountains themselves seemed to shiver in acknowledgement of his existence, as though they too had sensed the impossible truth, that some children are not born to live ordinary lives, but to remind the living of their own fragility in the face of the unknown. As Thomas Weaver entered his 14th year, the stories of his unnatural abilities spread beyond the valley, carried by frightened travelers and whispered to curious strangers who rarely stayed long enough to verify them, yet those who did always returned with pale faces and trembling hands, recounting sightings of the boy standing atop hillsides at twilight, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he could see events yet to unfold, and those who approached him felt an invisible weight pressing against their chests, a suffocating awareness that the boy's mind was not simply alive, but vast, ancient, and unfathomable, and on more than one occasion, men claimed their knives and torches fell useless in their hands, as though the very air around Thomas resisted violence, bending and twisting to protect him, and the villagers' fear became obsession, their prayers desperate and continuous, yet nothing could alter the boy's path, for he moved through the valley like a shadow, observing, learning, waiting, his presence marking every tree, every stone, every whispered conversation, and children who once dared to follow him into the woods spoke of strange sounds, whispers not carried by wind, shapes shifting just beyond the line of sight, and an overwhelming certainty that Thomas Weaver was older than the mountains themselves, that he was born to haunt, to test, to remind all who live that some mysteries are too vast for human understanding, that science, logic, and reason fall silent before the inexplicable, and that the boy's story would linger long after the valley forgot the names of those who dared call him human. By 15, Thomas Weaver's presence was no longer merely unsettling, it had become a living legend, a force the valley could not ignore, for doors would creak open by themselves when he approached, lanterns would flicker and die, and even the most rational adults admitted to hearing faint whispers in empty rooms, as if unseen mouths spoke words meant only for them, and when Thomas walked along the frozen fields, the snow beneath his feet seemed to refuse to record his passage, leaving no trace, no explanation, and yet every villager felt the weight of his gaze, cold and unblinking, as though he could see through flesh and bone, reading the fear and secrets that no one dared speak, and those brave enough to confront him often returned changed, hollow-eyed and silent, muttering that he had whispered their names without moving his lips, that he had smiled faintly while their own hearts raced as though in acknowledgement of some dreadful truth, and the children, who once tried to play near him, began to avoid the woods entirely, convinced that Thomas was something else, something older than the trees, something that had always been there, waiting, watching, and as the wind howled through the Appalachian ridges at night, carrying the faint echo of laughter that no one could place, it became painfully clear to every soul in the valley, Thomas Weaver was not merely a boy, he was a riddle of existence, a living shadow whose life mocked every law of nature and reason, a question that science could not begin to answer and that no one alive could dare solve. The years pressed on, and Thomas Weaver's reputation became something of a mythic terror, whispered from cabin to cabin, and yet no tale could fully capture the unnatural gravity of his presence, for he moved through the valley like a living shadow, and even the strongest men admitted that when his gaze fell upon them, their knees weakened, their breath caught, and every nerve in their bodies screamed in warning, and Livestock refused to graze near him, horses bolted without reason, and dogs cowered and whimpered, sensing a force that no one could define, while children who dared cross paths with him returned pale and trembling, claiming to have heard voices not carried by wind, shadows twisting unnaturally around them, and Thomas himself said nothing, never cried, never laughed, his expression always the same faint, unreadable curve of lips, as if he had glimpsed truths too vast and too terrible for human understanding, and the elders of the valley grew fearful not just of the boy, but of what he represented, a living proof that some lives exist outside reason, outside science, and outside the comforting illusions of safety, a presence that reminded them that the world is larger, darker, and far stranger than anyone could ever imagine, and that Thomas Weaver was its impossible child, a riddle of flesh and shadow that would haunt the memory of Appalachia for generations to come. As Thomas Weaver approached 16, the valley began to change around him, subtly at first, as though the very air and earth conspired to reflect the unnatural aura he carried, and the nights grew longer, shadows stretching with a life of their own, twisting into shapes that vanished the moment one blinked, and villagers began reporting the faint echo of footsteps behind them when they walked alone, though Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and the forest seemed to lean inward, listening, waiting, as if aware that the boy had become more than human, more than child, more than a question to be solved, and when he entered homes, no locks or bolts could keep him out, yet he touched nothing, stole nothing, and simply stood silently in corners, observing, his gaze penetrating walls, closets, even the minds of those who dared meet it, and the valley elders whispered of old legends, of spirits that could assume flesh, of shadows that learn and remember, and while some dismissed it as superstition, others knew with unshakable certainty that science had failed, reason had failed, and that Thomas Weaver was a presence that existed entirely beyond human understanding, a living darkness that grew with each passing day, and every man, woman, and child understood that the boy was not merely a part of their world, but a force pressing upon it, bending it, whispering truths in silence that no one alive could dare acknowledge, for to do so would be to invite the impossible too close to one's soul. By the time Thomas Weaver reached 17, the valley had come to fear the very shadow he cast, for it seemed to move with a will of its own, stretching unnaturally along the ground, curling against walls, and at night the wind carried whispers too faint to understand yet impossible to ignore, and travelers who passed through spoke of glimpsing a pale figure watching from the tree line, unmoving, unblinking, a presence that made their hearts hammer and their stomachs twist with a dread they could not name, and once, a young man dared to confront him in the clearing beyond the river, torch held high, voice raised in defiance, yet Thomas did not flee, did not speak, and the boy's gaze alone seemed to paralyze him, his knees buckling, lungs burning, and when he finally collapsed, unable to cry out, Thomas simply turned, lifted a single hand, and walked away, leaving the man trembling and hollow, mumbling of a power no human should possess. And from that day forward, parents forbade their children from wandering near the forests, dogs refused to enter the woods at all, and the valley itself seemed to hold its breath whenever the boy passed, as if acknowledging that Thomas Weaver was no longer a child, no longer a resident of this earthly plane, but something older, something far beyond explanation, a living embodiment of the terrifying truth that some beings exist in the spaces between understanding and fear, and science could only stand helpless, unable to measure, classify, or define the boy whose presence had become a permanent wound in the fabric of Appalachia. At 18, Thomas Weaver had become a figure of pure legend, his reputation stretching beyond the valley as rumors spread to nearby towns, tales of a boy whose eyes held centuries of knowledge and whose silence was more terrifying than any scream, and villagers whispered that he could appear where he wished, crossing frozen fields in moments, standing at doorways that no one remembered opening, and his gaze alone seemed capable of bending reality, freezing men mid-step, turning hearts to ice, and animals fled at his approach, as though instinct recognized something ancient and unyielding in his presence, and those who dared confront him told of a cold so profound it penetrated bone, a weight that pressed upon their minds as if he could reach in and pluck their very thoughts, and the elders debated in hushed tones whether Thomas was a child cursed, a demon in flesh, or something far older than human understanding. Yet no one could deny the truth that he carried the air of inevitability, that his presence altered the valley itself, bending shadows, twisting wind, and whispering in ways the mind could scarcely perceive, and though many prayed, fled, or hid, Thomas Weaver moved like a constant tide through their lives, an impossible question, a living shadow, a force that no law of nature could bind, and every man, woman, and child knew that the boy whom science could never explain had become more than legend. He had become the living heartbeat of fear that pulsed through Appalachia, a presence that would linger long after all who had seen him were gone. By the time Thomas Weaver neared 19, the valley had become a place where whispers of his presence dominated every conversation, and even the bravest men and women avoided venturing out after dusk, for the boy's footsteps, though soundless, seemed to echo in their minds, and shadows twisted unnaturally in his presence, bending toward him as if drawn by an unseen gravity. And travelers spoke of glimpsing him at impossible distances, standing atop hillsides, unmoving, watching them with eyes that seemed to pierce through time itself, and those who dared speak to him described a presence that felt alive, ancient, and incomprehensibly patient, as though the boy carried the weight of centuries in his chest, and even in the safety of their homes, families could feel the cold ripple of his attention, an unseen pressure that turned every heart to ice, and the local physician, long retired, whispered that Thomas was not human, that no human laws, no science, could ever hold him, and the forest seemed to recognize this truth too, the wind bending around him, the trees leaning toward him in silent acknowledgement, and every villager understood a terrifying fact: Thomas Weaver was no longer merely a boy, no longer merely part of their world, but something older, something impossible, a living enigma that had become the very shadow of the valley itself, and even generations later, the mountains would carry his story in the sighing of the wind, a story that science could never explain, a story that left every listener with the shiver of knowing some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. By the 20th year of Thomas Weaver's life, the valley had long ceased to treat him as a mere boy, for he had become an eternal presence, a living shadow woven into the fabric of Appalachia itself, and those who dared speak of him often fell silent mid-sentence, haunted by memories of glimpses they could not explain, of footsteps that seemed to follow them in empty rooms, of the weight of a gaze that could see not just through flesh but through the very essence of a person, and travelers who crossed the ridges swore they felt the air thicken, the wind bending unnaturally around them as if the world itself acknowledged his existence, and even the oldest, wisest elders admitted that Thomas Weaver was not a child of flesh and blood alone, but a force, an enigma, a presence older than memory, older than the mountains, something beyond the reach of reason, beyond the comprehension of science. And in the quietest hours of the night, when the snow fell silently upon the hollow, and the wind whispered secrets through the skeletal trees, the villagers would catch glimpses of him standing just beyond the edge of firelight, watching, smiling faintly with that impossible, unreadable expression, a living proof that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some forces are not meant to be understood. And Thomas Weaver, the sinister Appalachian boy that science could never explain, remained forever a question, a shadow, a reminder that the world is larger, darker, and far stranger than any human mind could ever truly comprehend. If you want to hear more chilling tales like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the darkest mysteries waiting in the shadows. And tell us in the comments, what do you think happened to Thomas Weaver? Could he still be out there, watching?